You don't even use it half the year, Lee. It's practically sitting there empty while my kids have nowhere to spend the summer. My brother said it the way you might mention you're out of milk. Casually, reaching across the Thanksgiving table for the sweet potato casserole without even glancing up at me. My mother set her fork down and pressed her hands together like she was about to say grace a second time. Seth does have a point, sweetheart. You're always working. My father gave a slow, agreeable nod in the direction of his mashed potatoes, and that was apparently enough for everyone at the table to consider the matter half settled. And just like that, the waterfront cottage I had spent 9 years saving to buy. 2 acres of Georgian Bay shoreline that had cost me every dollar I had scraped together, plus a mortgage I was still actively paying down, became a dinner conversation, handled as casually as a dish being passed around. My name is Lee. I'm 32 years old. I am a senior project manager at a construction technology firm in Toronto, and I have been working since I was 19. I put myself through university at Ryerson, paid off every dollar of my student loans before I turned 27, and spent nearly a decade building the kind of financial position that allowed me to do, finally, the thing I had been quietly dreaming about since childhood. Buy a place on the water. Not a condo, not a timeshare, a real cottage, with a dock and a boathouse and a wood stove in the living room that smells like pine resin and old winters, and everything that matters. I found it listed in March 2 springs ago. I paid $2.3 million for it, savings, a partial draw from the inheritance my grandmother had left me, and a mortgage I qualified for on my own income alone. I signed the papers by myself in a notary's office in Gravenhurst on a gray Tuesday afternoon and cried in my car for 20 minutes after, because I could not believe something I had worked that hard for was actually, finally, real. My brother Seth is 36. He runs a small renovation contracting business out of Hamilton that has been, by his own optimistic description, almost taking off for most of the past 8 years. He and his wife Darlene have 3 children under 10. They live in a semi-detached in Stony Creek that Darlene's parents helped them purchase with a down payment gift when the kids were small. Darlene works part-time at a dental office 3 days a week. They are not struggling in the way that demands sympathy. There is food on the table, there are after-school activities, there are summer vacations. But they have spent most of their adult lives making financial decisions with the quiet assumption that someone else would eventually absorb whatever gaps appeared. That someone had always been my grandmother. Then my parents. And now, apparently, me. The Thanksgiving comment wasn't the first signal. The previous summer, Seth had mentioned twice, once in June, once in early July, that the kids would love a week at the cottage. I had said yes us both times. I invited them. I gave them the week of the 16th of July when I was in Calgary for work, left the lockbox code, sent a detailed message about the water pump, the propane connection, where the extra life jackets were stored. I came back 9 days later to a broken screen door off its hinges, a propane valve someone had left partially open on the deck, a ring of mildew on the boathouse floor from something spilled and not cleaned, and a folded note on the kitchen counter that said thanks. Had a great time. No mention of the door. No mention of the propane. Darlene texted me 2 days after I returned to say the kids had such a wonderful time and were already asking when they could visit again. I didn't respond to that text right away. I thought about it for 3 days and then wrote back. Glad they had fun. That was all. So when Seth sat at my parents' Thanksgiving table in October and told me, with the relaxed confidence of someone who has never had to fight for anything, that a property of that size was excessive for a single person, that it sat idle, that his family had genuine practical need for it, in a way that I, living alone, simply did not, I felt something go very still inside me, not hurt, not even angry exactly. Still, the way a room goes silent before weather moves in. My mother has a talent for dressing things up so they sound collaborative. Nobody's saying you have to give anything up, Lee. But maybe you and Seth could work something out. A shared use arrangement. Something sensible. She smiled with the serenity of someone who had already decided where this was going. You could still come up on weekends whenever you like. Darlene, who had been sitting with a particular quality of stillness, the stillness of someone who has been waiting for her moment, looked across the table and said, "We were actually thinking something more permanent might make better sense for everyone. Long-term stability. We'd be open to being added to the deed. As equal co-owners." She glanced at Seth. "We'd obviously carry the operating costs from that point forward." My mother nodded. "See? Very reasonable." I asked, very calmly, whether they would also be contributing to the outstanding mortgage. There was a pause that lasted long enough to have its own weather. "We'd contribute what we can," Seth said, in the tone people use when they mean no, and want to sound mature while saying it. My father said, "Lay. Your brother has 3 young children, you live alone." He said it as though living alone were a kind of moral deficit, as though the absence of a husband and children in my house was a reasonable grounds for redistributing the assets I'd built in their absence. I looked around the table at the 4 of them, Seth cutting into his turkey, Darlene with her hands folded, my mother's reading glasses pushed up on her head, my father staring at the gravy boat, and I thought about my grandmother. About a specific thing she used to say when I was small, something she told me while we were washing dishes together in her kitchen in Barrie. She said, "People who grab loudly have already lost. The ones worth watching are the ones who wait." I told Seth and Darlene that if they were serious about this, we should handle it properly. Meet with an estate lawyer. My grandmother's estate had been partially involved in my property purchase, and it seemed sensible to understand what any transfer or co-ownership arrangement would mean from a legal standpoint before anyone signed anything. I said it all very evenly. Darlene's eyes lit up in that particular way. Seth sat back with the satisfied posture of someone who had already won. My mother exhaled slowly, relieved. My father looked briefly like he might say something, and then decided not to. None of them knew that I had already called Miss Reeves the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. My grandmother, Iris Calloway, died 4 years ago at the age of 81. She was a retired school teacher from Barrie who had quietly and without much fanfare spent 50 years building a modest but meaningful estate through disciplined saving, careful investment, a small inheritance of her own, and the eventual sale of a farmland property her parents had left her outside Collingwood. She left each of her grandchildren a portion. My share was $180,000, which I put directly into the cottage purchase. What I had not fully absorbed until I began working with Ms. Reeves on the property paperwork was that my grandmother had not simply drafted a will. She had established a formal family trust, the Calloway Family Trust, administered by an independent trust company in Barrie, with Miss Reeves as supervising legal counsel. The trust governed the distributions to each family member. A quarterly income supplement my parents received, a separate educational savings contribution for Seth's children, and the one-time distributions to each grandchild. Buried in Schedule D of the trust agreement, a section I had skimmed when Miss Reeves first walked me through the documents after my grandmother's death and never thought much about since, was a clause that my grandmother had inserted with, as Miss Reeves described it during our phone call in October, unusual specificity for a layperson. The clause stated that if any named trust beneficiary attempted to pressure, coerce, or manipulate a fellow beneficiary into surrendering, sharing, or transferring a property acquired in whole or in part using trust distributions, the offending beneficiary would be referred immediately to the trust company's discretionary committee for a formal review of their beneficiary status, with full authority to suspend or permanently revoke all distributions, effective retroactively if circumstances warranted. My grandmother had written this clause into the trust 15 years before she died. Ms. Reeves told me she had been motivated by watching 2 of her own siblings spend years in a dispute over a waterfront property in Collingwood after a parent's death, a dispute that had cost them both the property and each other. My grandmother had never spoken to me about it directly, but she had paid a lawyer to make sure so the possibility was covered. She had thought of me before I had thought of myself. I sat in a parking garage in downtown Toronto for 45 minutes after that call, in the dark of my car, listening to the ventilation system run. When I drove home, I made tea and sat on my balcony and looked at the city lights for a long time, thinking about my grandmother at her kitchen counter, the shortbread tin, the way her handwriting on birthday cards always curled slightly at the capital letters. The meeting at Miss Reeves's office was set for a Wednesday morning in early November. Her firm occupies 2 floors of a glass office building in Midtown. The kind of space that is deliberately neutral and unhurried, where the carpet is thick and the framed prints on the walls are abstract enough to communicate nothing. I arrived 12 minutes early. I wore a charcoal coat I had bought myself 2 winters ago, properly fitted. I declined the assistant's offer of coffee. I sat in the chair closest to the window and looked at the city below and waited. Seth and Darlene arrived 7 minutes late. Before they had fully taken their seats, Darlene produced a thick folder from a large canvas tote and laid it on the table. She had brought renovation proposals. Not vague, speculative ones. Actual written quotes on company letterhead from 2 separate contractors, one of which was Seth's own firm, for a master suite expansion, a new wraparound deck, and the conversion of the boathouse into a year-round insulated studio. She had not asked me before having these commissioned. The quotes were detailed and itemized. There were paint chips clipped to the interior pages. The tabs were color-coded by project phase. She had clearly spent time on this folder. She was proud of it. My parents arrived separately, 5 minutes behind Seth and Darlene. My father looked uncomfortable from the moment he entered the room. The way he always does when he has agreed to be somewhere he isn't quite sure he should be. My mother had her reading glasses on her head and wore the brisk, settled expression of someone who has pre-decided the outcome and is merely waiting for the formality of paperwork. Seth pushed a document across the table toward Miss Reeves before she had opened her own briefcase. "We had our own solicitor draft a co-ownership proposal," he said. "It's straightforward. Lee retains a 40% interest. Darlene and I take 60. We cover operating costs from point of transfer. Our position is that it's more than fair, given that Lee's contribution from Grandma's estate represented less than 8% of the total purchase price." He had done the math. He was proud of the math. Darlene said, "We're flexible on the timeline. We'd allow Lee until end of February to transition her belongings and adjust her schedule." "Allow me, until end of February." My mother said, "It really is very reasonable, Lee." My father looked at the window. I looked at Ms. Reeves. She did not touch Seth's document. She reached into her briefcase and set a pale blue folder on the table. Slim, maybe 8 pages, the trust company's name embossed on the cover in dark ink. She placed it in the center of the table without any particular ceremony and opened it to the 3rd page. "Before anyone reviews a transfer proposal," Ms. Reeves said, in the careful, precise tone of someone who is being deliberate, "I need to draw your attention to a provision in the Calloway Family Trust that is directly relevant to this meeting." She oriented the page so that Seth and my father could see the highlighted paragraph. "Schedule D, Section 4. Your grandmother included this at the time the trust was formalized 15 years ago." Seth frowned. "What does a trust clause have to do with a property co-ownership agreement?" "The cottage was purchased in part with Lee's trust distribution," Ms. Reeves said. "That makes it a trust-linked asset under the terms of this section." She tapped the highlighted text. "The clause specifies that any attempt by a named beneficiary to pressure or coerce a fellow beneficiary into transferring or sharing a trust-linked property constitutes a formal triggering event. I notified the trust company last week, following Lee's disclosure that a formal co-ownership transfer was being proposed at this meeting." The discretionary committee convened Monday morning. Darlene's pen was still in her hand. She set it down very slowly. "A review of what?" Seth said, and his voice had changed register slightly. Of your family's continued beneficiary status within the trust, Ms. Reeves said. The committee has the authority to suspend or permanently revoke distributions. That includes the quarterly supplement your parents receive and the educational savings contributions that fund your children's RSSPs. The air left the room, not dramatically, just quietly, the way it does when something real has been said. My father picked up the document. His hands were steady, but his face was not. He read the highlighted clause once, his jaw tight. Then he read it again. He set the papers down with a kind of careful deliberateness and said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was smaller than I had heard it in years. Iris wouldn't have meant it this way. Your mother was quite intentional about this provision, Ms. Reeves said. She had it drafted after watching a property dispute cause irreparable damage within her own family. She did not want the same to happen to Lee. Seth looked at Darlene. The color-coded tabs on her renovation folder suddenly seemed to belong to a different afternoon entirely. Darlene was staring at the center of the table, with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not anger, not calculation, but something that looked uncomfortably close to reckoning. Then Seth turned to me, and for the first time in my adult memory, he did not look older or more certain, or already 2 steps ahead of wherever I was standing. He looked like someone who had walked through a confident door and found a different room on the other side. Lay, he said. Tell her it was a misunderstanding. Tell her we were just exploring options. You can fix this. Just tell her we weren't serious. My mother reached across the mahogany table and put her hand on my arm. The way she has done my entire life when she needs me to smooth something over for someone else. Lay, please. The Children's Education Fund. You can't let this affect the children. That's not who you are. I sat with that for one moment. That's not who you are. I had been hearing that sentence, in various forms, for 3 decades. A reminder, always gently delivered, that who I was someone who would absorb cost, reduce herself, accommodate, and smile through it. I moved my arm, stood up, and lifted my coat from the back of the chair. I didn't start this, I said. I was not shaking, which surprised me. I was not angry in the hot, loud way. I was calm in a way that felt earned. You came to this office with renovation quotes and a transfer proposal and a timeline to move my things out by February. You did that. I looked at Seth. You spent the summer treating my property like a free rental and came to Thanksgiving and told me I don't need what I built because you'd prefer to have it. And you brought the rest of this family along to agree with you because you knew that's how it always works. I picked up my bag. Grandma knew you too. That's why she wrote the clause. I looked at Darlene, who had not spoken in several minutes. I hope the rest of the meeting is useful, I said to Ms. Reeves, and I walked out. The weeks that followed were not peaceful, at least not initially. My mother called 11 times in the first 4 days. Each call went to voicemail. My father left 2 messages, both beginning with, I think everyone needs a moment to step back, and both ending without him having said anything of substance. Seth sent a long text on a Thursday night just before midnight that used the words entitled and legal loophole, and this isn't who we raised you to be, and concluded with a suggestion that I had become someone our grandmother would not recognize. I read it once. I did not reply. The trust company's review took 6 weeks. During that period, my parents' quarterly supplement and Seth's RESP contributions were both placed in a holding suspension. Not permanently revoked, but frozen. It was enough. Seth stopped talking about the co-ownership proposal. Darlene stopped texting. The renovation folder, I assumed, went into a drawer somewhere. The committee ultimately preserved the Children's Education Fund. Because my grandmother had inserted a specific carve-out in the trust, protecting minor beneficiaries from consequences generated by their parents' actions. My parents' supplement was suspended for 2 quarters as a formal caution. Seth and Darlene received a written notice that any further attempt to interfere with my interest in the cottage property would trigger permanent exclusion from the trust's beneficiary schedule. Seth did not contact me after that, not directly. In December, Darlene sent a single text message that read, "I hope you're happy with yourself." I read it sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold and thought about it honestly, the way you do when someone throws something like that at you, and there's no one else in the room. Was I happy? I sat with the question for a while. Not the giddy, heat of victory kind of happy. Something quieter. Something that felt like the absence of a weight I had been so accustomed to carrying, that I had stopped noticing its shape. I drove up to the cottage the third weekend in January. The bay was frozen solid, and the snow on the dock was undisturbed, and the light that comes across Georgian Bay in winter has a particular quality, low and silver and completely indifferent to anything happening on shore, that I find more settling than almost anything else I know. I built a fire in the wood stove. I made coffee. I sat at the table by the east window and watched the ice and thought about my grandmother. She used to bring a shortbread tin to family gatherings, the same blue tin every time, reused until the corners wore soft. She was not a woman who spoke about difficult things directly. She cooked around them, prepared around them, set in place the quiet structures that would hold when things got hard. I think she had watched enough of her own life to understand that the people who love you are not always the people who will protect you, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to build the protection in advance and say nothing about it. I don't know what comes next with my family. I don't spend much energy trying to predict it. What I know is that I wake up most mornings without the particular anxiety that used to accompany certain incoming calls, certain family dinners, certain casual mentions of what I owned and whether I really needed it. That anxiety had been there so long I had filed it under normal. Losing it felt strange for a while, like the silence after a sound you've stopped noticing. If you've ever sat at a table and felt the room decide something about your life before you had a chance to speak. If you've ever been told that what you built is excessive, that you live alone and therefore need less. That, being a good family member, means shrinking what you've earned to fill someone else's gap. I want to tell you that stillness is not the same as giving in. Knowing what you know and waiting for the right moment to let it speak is not weakness. It is, sometimes, the most complete form of standing your ground that exists. The cottage is mine. The ice will break on Georgian Bay in late March, and the geese will come back the way they always do, low over the water in the early morning, and the dock will smell like cold cedar in the beginning of something. I'll be there for it. If you've ever had to protect something you built from the people who expected you to hand it over, tell me in the comments. And tell me where in this country you're watching from. I always want to know how far a story can reach.